Hello, my name is Sherry. I'm a genealogy reference associate here at Midwest Genealogy Center, and today's class is going to be finding your Italian ancestors. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, as with anything we do in genealogy, we start with ourselves and work our way back. One of the reasons that we have to find, and this is the important part, the town or the parish or the province or the region in Italy where your ancestors came from is because there's no central location for records in Italy. So most of them are going to be at a different level. So they might be some at the province level, some at the town level, etc. So what we need to do is do our research here in the US where immigrants came and find out where they're from. And that way it narrows our search down so we're not covering the entire length and breadth of Italy as well as the island of Sicily. We can focus more specifically on a particular location. Also, too, a lot of the times, even though you'll see some, like our US Census records will say Italy as birthplace. But if that particular immigrant ancestor was actually talking to somebody or filling out forms, they more identified with the town they were from or the area they were from as opposed to the country. So a lot of times those records may have the actual place of birth listed. So you want to look through any and all records, whether you think they might be in there or not. And then if you run into a brick wall, well, you want to utilize what we call the fan method. So you're going to branch out a little bit. Say your direct ancestor, you're running into a brick wall, can't find anything on them. Look for their siblings, look for their children. Some of their records may even include the information that you're looking for. You might even branch out further to nieces and nephews. But somewhere you might find that information with someone else as opposed to with your direct ancestor. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the items that you're going to be looking for in the US. So you're going to look at census records, the federal census, maybe a state census or a territorial census, depending on when your ancestor came over. Birth, marriage, and death vital records, not only for them, but for maybe their significant other, or maybe for their kids, grandkids, etc. We want to look at cemetery records, naturalization and church records, military records. If they served in World War I or World War II, they'll have a selective service record that will indicate their place of birth. So you want to take a look and see if you can find one of those. Passenger list is another item. And like I said, it's not exhaustive. If, for example, your ancestors settled in an area that had an Italian ethnic society or something related to that, or maybe they belong to the Freemasons or something, another kind of group, you want to look for those records as well. Social media is also a good place to look for particular groups that are specific to that area in Italy. I've had significant success with that, belonging to several of the Italian genealogy groups on Facebook and getting records from people who are actually living in the area. And they've sent me records. So, you never know where you're going to find a record. So let's briefly talk about some of these options, and then we'll move into the actual Italian records. So we're going to start with US Census records. The vast majority of Italian immigrants came over in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So those are the census records you're going to be taking a good, strong look at for birth location, immigration year, naturalization status in the 1900s through the 1930s. And if you are lucky enough to have had your ancestor naturalized by 1920, it will actually tell you the naturalization year. These are all clues as to where to go to look for these records. Granted, depending on who gave the information, those years may be a little bit different, especially as you get further away from the event. People sometimes don't quite remember exactly when that particular event happened. But you want to take a look at them anyway, just to give you a shorter timeline to focus on. So here's an example. This is a 1920 federal census for Luca DiMaggio, and he's living there with his wife and his kids. And if you take a real close look, he was born in Italy, so was his wife, but all of his kids were born in Louisiana. But then we can focus in on the three columns that we're really interested in, and that's the year of immigration, which they list as 1896. So that'll give me a time period where I'm going to go look for that passenger list. It also tells me whether or not they were naturalized, and it has the NA, which is the abbreviation they use for naturalization. So they are citizens of the US now in 1920. If it said AL, they mean they're still an alien. They have not started the process or been naturalized. If it says PA, that means that's their first papers, because there's a two-step process to become a citizen back in that time period. You would submit your intent to become a naturalized citizen, which would be your first papers. And then after you lived in the country for a certain length of time, you would apply for naturalization. So there'd be two forms that they would have had to fill out. On this particular record, it shows the year of naturalization. This is the 1920 census, and it says 1900. So that's where I would focus on, is around the 1900 area. That's where I'd be looking for papers for Luca, and his wife would have naturalized with him. She wouldn't have had to file separately at this time period. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, about the different laws that naturalization had throughout the time period. Vital records would be the other thing you'd be looking at, birth, marriage, and death. Not only birth, and maybe he came over alone or she came over alone and they married here in the country. You want to check the marriage record to see what information is on that, because it may say more than just Italy. It may actually give you the town that they're from. Children, maybe find out when that particular area they were from started keeping birth certificates. You might be able to find out on the birth certificate what town they were from. Normally, you might find a birth or death index, like say an Ancestry or Family Search. It'll give you some information, but at least it'll tell you where to look for the rest of the information that might be on the actual document. And you definitely want to look at the actual document. If the civil record doesn't exist, most Italians are Roman Catholic. There will be a church record. My grandfather, who was an immigrant ancestor, came over here and married here in the US. So when they married in the church asked them both where they were born. And that was one of the pieces of paper that I found that listed the town in Italy that he was from. So the Roman Catholic Church kept excellent records. So and indeed, most of them were Roman Catholic, that might be a place to look as well. You can also check, say, they were from New York. There's tons of parishes in New York, so you have to kind of narrow down based on where they live, which church they went to, and you might want to check the church and see if they keep records, or if they've sent them to the diocese, the Catholic diocese of that area. They would have some records as well. And as I mentioned, you want to kind of branch out just in case you're running into a brick wall with your ancestor. Maybe the siblings have some documents that actually list the town that everyone was from, or maybe the nieces and nephews or cousins. A lot of the times that when immigrant ancestors, especially Italians, came over to the US, they settled in the same area that other people from that town or province were from. So for example, if your ancestor was from Northern Italy, say in the Piedmont region, for example, they probably settled in an area of the town they decided to settle in with other people from the Piedmont region. So that's why we want to branch out and kind of look at the people that are living next door or around the corner, just to see if we can find information on that location. And again, you want to get a copy of that record. You want to see the whole record to see what all the information you can find. Another thing is it may not be online. So you may have to go to a county courthouse or state archive to find it. One example I put here is New York City marriages. They had you ask for not only your birthplace and your spouse's birthplace, but the birthplace of your parents as well. So there's another clue that might help you. And here's an example. Let's say, for example, Romeo Brackenridge was your ancestor, and you're trying to find some information on them. Well, notice this I took from Ancestry. They have an index, but they don't have the actual record, okay? So we look at the source information. They got this information from Family Search, which also has an index, not the actual documents necessarily. But we do know it's from West Virginia. We figured that out. This original one is a birth record for one of his sons. So we can do some more research, and we find another one down here, which lists that Mr. Breckenridge, this marriage, Sarah Eagle, in 1871 in Greenbrier, West Virginia. We've narrowed down further. This might be where we're going to have to go look at the county courthouse or the area courthouse to find that marriage license to see if that information that we're looking for is contained on that license. Cemetery records. Further back you go, the more information I have been finding on headstones. Just an FYI, we do have, if you're interested in more information about like the cemetery art that's on some headstones, maybe they have a Masonic symbol on it, which would indicate they were part of the Masons. You might be able to find information there. We do have a free class that we teach periodically on cemetery art. So that might be something you might be interested in. But let's look at this example. So let's say you are a descendant of Gaetano Repolino. On his particular headstone here, notice that not only does it have his parents' names, Angelo and Rosa, it has Rosa's maiden name on it. Not only does it tell you the town they're from, Licata, but it also tells you the province they're from, Girgente. Gives you the year of his birth. We've gotten a lot of information right there. And then his date of death. So just on that one headstone, we have found a lot of information, including the information we need to look at records over in Italy. If the headstone isn't that helpful to you, you can always check at the cemetery office and see if they have other documents that has been saved that might have that information on it. Check local historical and genealogical societies, and see if they might have some information. But you never know what you're going to find on a cemetery record. And then we get into naturalization. A lot of Italians did naturalize. A lot of Italians didn't naturalize. And there were different laws throughout the different time periods. Everything got standardized around 1906. So you will see the place of birth, the place of last residence, and you might find the place of birth of the spouse as well. As I mentioned, up until 1922, women were naturalized with their husbands. They did not necessarily have to be on the form, nor did the minor children. But if the husband naturalized, the wife and the minor children automatically became naturalized. After 1922, they had to submit their own application for naturalization. Before 1906, this is where it gets a little tricky. They could have naturalized in a federal court or a state court or a local court. It just depends. So at that particular point, you're going to be looking at several different places to find the information that you're looking for. Also, too, on their forms, the wife did not need to be listed, nor did the minor children. It was just automatically assumed if that person was married, they would be automatically naturalized when the husband or the father naturalized. Few years back, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which we abbreviated as INS, became the USCIS. Their website does have a page called their genealogy program. If you find out that your ancestor naturalized, you can submit a request to check their index and find out when that happened. Once you find the information like the naturalization number, etc., you can contact them and request the actual records, okay? Expect a wait, obviously. It's going to take a while for them to get back to you. But they do have what they call citizenship files or C files at this particular location. Like I said, after 1906, it was a lot easier because they would, depending on the court that they went to get naturalized, they would have to send a copy of it to the USCIS. So they would have it in their files as well. Now, you can always, like I said, request a search of the index. Once you get the numbers that you need, you can always request the actual documents. After 1906, when the husband or father was petitioning for naturalization, they would list the wife's name and her information and the children's name and their information on their form as well. But later on in the late 20s, after women got the right to vote, etc., they would be required, as well as children over the age of 18 would be required to submit a petition for themselves. They couldn't just ride on the coattails of the father or the husband. And then there are also the unusual parts where a naturalized or US citizen, if they married somebody who was not a citizen, they would lose their citizenship. And this happened for a brief period of time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they would have to submit, even if they had never left the country, they would have to submit a petition to naturalize just to get their citizenship back. Also, other things, for example, if a person decided they wanted to join the Canadian Armed Forces in World War I and fight that way instead of being the Americans, I mean, they were both allies anyway. They might have lost their citizenship temporarily, then they would have had to apply again. Not all of the naturalization records are online, but you can contact or go to the National Archives website to see what they have. Sometimes you can actually go to one of their branches and view the information there. And there's the website there, so you can take a look at what records they have between 1790 and 1995. So here's an example. This is for Serafino Nicola Correa. This is his declaration of intent. And where the arrow is shows the place he was born. There's also a nice photograph of him as well. And this was, he made his intent to naturalize in Cleveland. So this is a Cleveland record. Then he lived in the US for a certain number of years, and then he petitioned to become a citizen. And once again, here's the form that he would have filled out. And again, it would list his place of birth. So you would actually know the town he's from and the location. And if any information you'll see in the center here is going to list family names on the naturalization record. So you've got more information of other people, children and the wife, in case she was born in the same town, it would verify that information. So then we have church records, mainly Roman Catholic church records. There'll be a baptism record for children. If he or she came over to the country single and they got married here, there's going to be a Catholic church record for the marriage. If they passed away here, they might have had a church burial. So there'll be records available. It'll also not only include the place of birth, it'll include the date of the baptism, parents' names, godparents' names, who probably are related in some way to the parents, as well as the parish name. You know, and again, it could be at the actual church, it could be at the diocese level, or they might have been transferred to a state archive. But you can start with the parish and then work your way up. A lot of Catholic records are on Ancestry and Family Search, as well as Find My Past. They have what they call the Catholic Heritage Archive. That has records not only for the US, but also for England and Ireland and other countries as well. Okay, here's an example for Mrs. Mary Piccolo. This is from Utah. This is from the US Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. Okay, and I found this on Ancestry. The headings are in Latin, but I did translate them for everybody. So you got her name, their parents' names, the husband's name, when she passed, the age she was when she passed, and where she's from. So once again, we have information on the location that she's from, when she passed away, when she was buried, the cemetery she's buried at, the minister, and then any annotations that the minister needed to make on the document. But right here in this US record, we've got what we need to go back over to Italy to look for records. This kind of paper you're going to see a lot more often than maybe this kind, but once again, this still has all the information you need to narrow down your search, okay? So birthplace, Calabria, Italy. So we know we're focusing on a particular area of Italy at that point. And don't be surprised if you see some towns have the same name as some provinces that might have the same name as some regions. That does occur. Military records, if they were around in World War I or World War II, they probably filled out a selective service card, which would have required them to list their place of birth. It would also, if they had somebody back in the old country that would always know where they were, they would list them as well. So if you don't find the place of birth from that person, you can always look at who they say will always know where they're at and see where they were from. But again, a lot of these cards are on Family Search, Ancestry, and Fold 3. So you can find a lot of the information. Granted too, you will find that service records itself, not just the selective service card, but the actual service records may still be available that you can find from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. A lot of the Army records were destroyed in a fire in 1973, but you might find something. Not all were destroyed, but most of them were. But if they were, say, part of the Navy or the Air Force, you might be able to find something there. And here's an example. This is Vito Volpi's registration card for World War II. And I got this off of Fold 3. And once again, where the arrow is, lists the town and its place of birth, okay? And on the flip side, it gives a description. So you kind of know what he looks like, which is always nice too. It kind of fills in the information that you have on your particular ancestor. And then passenger list records. So between 1855 and 1900, there was over 1 million Italian immigrants that arrived. Between 1880 and 1921, Italian Americans were the largest ethnic group. The common ports would have been New York, so either Castle Garden or Ellis Island, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Orleans. New Orleans would be a big one in the late 1800s because a lot of the cotton mills and those various industries down in the South needed workers. And so the Italians came in through New Orleans to get jobs there, picking cotton or, in the mills or whatever to do those works that they needed people for. There, at one point in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a large Italian population in New Orleans. Before 1820, because that's when the first mandated passenger list, that's when the government required the captain to provide them with a passenger list. They're hit or miss. There might be some still in existence. Some of them may no longer be in existence, but there might be an indication in another reference source to indicate when and who was on a particular ship. So depending on the time period, you're going to get some bare bones information, some of the earlier lists, though they may still list a town on them. Place of birth, they started asking for that around 1906. And then in 1907, they wanted to know the closest relative that was still back in the home country. So you would have had a couple of indications to find out the town they were from based on some of the later passenger lists. So here's an example. Before 1906, most passenger lists were 2 pages, was 1 page long, excuse me. After that, you'll usually find what they call a 2-page list, only it's just one large page that branched over on the book. So here's an example of a 1910 passenger list. And we're going to look at number 13 there. And this is his information. So we've got a Giuseppe Volpi who's coming over to Ellis Island. He came in through Ellis. But you'll see here on this one, their last residence. And the guy above him was from Licata. So they just been a little X meaning ditto for this guy. So Giuseppe also came from Licata. So that was his place of last residence. But we also have information on the closest relative that is still living where he's from. And he lists his mom. So not only do we know his mom's name now and her maiden name, because you'll notice they put Carmela Ripolino, so that's her maiden name. But on the second page, we also have the birthplace information. Once again, it shows Licata, and there were quite a few people on that ship from the same town. So based on that passenger list, we know he's from Licata. So we can Google or Bing that and find out where Licata is if we don't already know. And then we can narrow down our search for Italian records. I mentioned the ethnic societies. A lot in the early 1900s, a lot of the ethnic groups belonged to societies, for camaraderie, because they have left their old country and they are in a new country and don't know a whole lot of people. So they're going to try to find people of their type from the same area and kind of have a social gatherings with us. You might find the applications for those particular ethnic societies. Also, don't forget about periodicals and newsletters. A lot of information might be found in those that you might not find online or anywhere else. Facebook groups, I mentioned those. They've got general ones like Italian genealogy. They've got specific ones like Northern Italian genealogy or Sicilian and Southern Italian genealogy. You can belong to those groups, pose questions to them. I have an ancestor, I'm looking for this particular record. Where might I go to find that record? And like I said earlier, I have been able to find people living in the towns I've been looking for, and they were kind enough to find the record and send that to me. So you never know what you're going to find, but Instagram and Pinterest are other places you might want to look. So now let's talk about Italy itself. Italy was a country back in 1861. Before that, it was just, as this map shows, a bunch of different city-states ruled by different ruling families, okay? Once it was unified, they divided the country up into regions, which would be the same as a state, provinces, which would be like a county, and then the towns. And you'll notice through the years that those numbers changed. So if you find out that the town you're looking for might be on a borderline at 1 year in one particular province, you might want to keep checking your history and maps to make sure it's still in that province because it might have moved. They did the same thing with parishes. They might have combined parishes or got rid of some parishes. So just be aware that things were in flux throughout Italy's existence, and you might have to find it in more than one location. And as I've said before, records could be at the region level, the province level, the parish level, the town level. So why do we have civil registration in Italy? Well, it's all about Napoleon. Napoleon conquered a lot of what is now northern Italy. And he implemented civil registration, which was based on what the French were doing at the time. Some areas in the South did not start in 1806 when Napoleon took over northern Italy. When Napoleon was defeated, some of those areas stopped civil registration and then started it back up again later. So you might have gaps in the time periods, or they may not start till later. For example, Sicily didn't start civil registration in 1820, and even though it wasn't conquered by Napoleon, they did start their civil registration and make it similar to the records that were taking place in the northern areas that Napoleon did conquer. So don't be surprised if you start going back in time and you're finding these records, and then all of a sudden they stop for a period and then they start up again. That's what happened. And for those of you who are interested, this is what the map looked like when Napoleon was the greatest extent of his empire. So you have the brown areas, which was the French Empire, and then everything in green was the states under his control. And you see a big chunk of Italy was covered. Sicily was not conquered by Napoleon. They were against Napoleon, so was some of the other countries like Russia and Great Britain. The Austrian Empire was an ally, basically because they didn't want to get conquered. So they played nice with Napoleon for that time period. But at the height of his empire, this is what it looks like. This is what the map looked like. So let's talk about Italy's civil registration. They would have books of registers for births, marriages, and deaths, okay? If they had more births than could be filled, they filled up the whole volume, they would have started a second volume. Then at the end of the year, the registrar would go back through those volumes and create an index. Not everybody did that, but most of the time they would create an index. It would be in alphabetical order, either by first name or last name, usually by the surname, and it would indicate where in that volume you would find that particular entry for that particular person. All these records are going to be in Italian, but it's easy to see the pattern that they used and to extract the information, which we will talk about in a moment. Some of the northern areas, which were taken over by the French for a period of time, by the Germans for a period of time, those records may be in either French or German. So you're going to do the same thing with those as you would with Italian records. You're going to try to find the pattern and extract the information from it. So let's talk about the types of records. So we're going to talk about births first. They're going to have the child's name, what the sex of the child was, the birth date and birthplace, the parents' names. Normally, what they would do, either the father or the midwife would bring the child into the registrar's office to register the birth, okay? If, for example, this person who was born in this particular town also married in the town, also died in the town, there will be annotations in the margin, which I'll show you an example of later, of that information so you know what volume to go to, you know what year it is. Marriages. Napoleonic law required that the marriages be performed by civil authorities. Did not care if they got married in the church. However, being Roman Catholic, most of the times they would get married in the church and forget about the civil one until it was necessary. A lot of people would register once they had a child because they could not send the child to a public school without it being legitimate. So they would have to register the child and then they'd have to get married. So the dates might be way far apart. But they were usually performed and recorded where the bride lived. 9 times out of 10, the bride and the groom lived in the same town. You would also have additional documents with a marriage record. So not only in Italy, but in a couple other countries, you would find that they had to post a notice, either at the registrar's office or at the church, for 3 weeks prior to the wedding to let them know that these two people are getting married. And if they had any reason that they shouldn't get married, they needed to come to talk to either the priest or the registrar. They would also have to have records proving their births, proving their parents' births and or deaths. Sometimes you'll find those additional records with the marriage record in a volume. Sometimes they'll be in a separate volume. It just depends on how they did it in that particular area. I have found some records in southern Italy. Everything was attached together with the marriage record in one place. That's all I had to look for it. Some of them, such as some of the records in Sicily, are in separate volumes. So I'd find the marriage record in one volume, and then I'd have to go to another volume to find the other information. And then we have death records. The person who died, their age, where they were born, where they lived, what their occupation was. If they were married, their spouse's names would be there. And it didn't matter how old they were, their parents' names would be included on the death record as well, and whether or not they were living. Usually these would be registered in the civil office a day or so after the death. So we're going to start with birth records. So here's an example of a couple of pages out of a volume, and we see there's 3 entries. What they would do is the first person who was born, so there was a birth in January 1st and they came into the registrar's office, that would be considered number 1. So that would be the number that you would see up here above the name. If they were the second one, it'd be the second, et cetera, how many there were. We're going to focus in on this one here. This is Giuseppe Volpi. We looked at his passenger list earlier. He was the 618th baby born in this particular town in this particular year, okay? Notice too that the further back you go, it's all handwritten. But a lot of these later ones in the late 1800s, early 1900s are going to be forms that they just filled out. So you're going to focus more on the handwriting parts as opposed to the other parts. So you'll notice in the column, they've got his last name, first name. Sometimes they'll do first name, last name, but this is usually primarily how it's done. And then we're going to get into the actual document. So you're going to see 7 pieces of information in this first section, okay? They wrote out everything. So instead of it saying October 24th, 1883, it's going to say 1,883 and 24 will be written out and the October will be written out. It's not abbreviated, but that will be that first date on that first line is the date of registration, not necessarily the date of birth, okay? So you're going to find out that Giuseppe's birth was registered on October 24th, 1883 at 10:30 a.m. And then after that, it lists the registrar's information, you know, who he was, when he became the registrar, how long he's going to be the registrar. So unless your ancestor is the registrar, we are going to skip on down to the town. So you'll see state civil, right down here, state civil de commune. So the town of, and then the town, in this case, it's Licata. Okay, this is where Giuseppe was born. And then on number 4, the next person you're going to see on there is either going to be the father or the midwife. In this instance, the father came with the child to register the birth. So Angelo is his father. And then it's going to list how old he is, what he does for a living, and where he lives. So in this particular instance, and again, right now, all I need to do to extract this information is know my months in Italian and my numbers in Italian, okay? And they have lists out there. Family Search has a wonderful genealogy word list that you can use to extract information out of these things. So we find out that Angelo Volpi, he's 43 years old at the time of birth. He's a farmer. Contadino can be either farmer or peasant, depending on how you want to look at it. And he lived in the city, okay? And then down here on number 5 that I have listed, this is the actual date of birth, okay? So if it's different from the date of registration, which it normally is, it's going to list the time, the date, and the street that the child was born. So in this particular instance, it's saying that in the AM of 1:20, so 1:20 a.m. in the morning, on October 23rd, so the day before, is when Giuseppe was born, okay? And that's really all I need to know, unless I want to know that Via Bracco, which is the street of Bracco Street, is where he was born at. And then we're going to find out who the mother is. So as you'll see, line 6, we have the name Carmela Ripolino. Remember, that's the same name that was on the passenger list. So we know we got the right person. And all of these official documents are going to have the mother's maiden name or the wife's maiden name on them, okay? And then you go a little bit further down, it says masculine, so we know it's a boy. And then it says what his name is, Giuseppe. So all of that information is right there. So we know his date of birth, the date he was registered in the civil registration office. We know the father's name, we know the mother's name. And notice too that a lot of times, most Italians don't have middle names. Some of them will, but most of them will not. There'll be a first name listed there only. And then the rest of this document is just the witnesses. So we have a couple of witnesses that come in with the father saying, yeah, we were there when the birth happened. We can say that this is accurate. So we have Francesco Ripolino. And notice too, I want to show you, they put the last name first, and then sometimes they will try to squeeze that name in. So you'll see it going down the side of the page, but sometimes they will split it. So we got Fran, and then on the next line, Cesco. So just be aware that they do that sometimes. Their ages, their occupation, and where they live. So we've got Francesco Ripolino and we've got Vincenzo Cardella. Both of them live in Licata. Both of them are farmers. Francesco, probably in some way or other, is related to Carmela. So here's another family member that we're going to have to take a look at. And they all live in Licata, so everybody there. Then you have these lines that the registrar had to write in. Many of the farmers, peasants, whatever you want to call them, especially in the South, were illiterate. They could not read or write. They were farmers. They didn't need it to read or write. So he would put that down because everybody is supposed to sign at the bottom of the entry. But you'll notice there's only one signature, and that's the registrar's signature. So he has to put this in. I read this document to everybody so they would know what is put down, but they could not sign their names because they were illiterate. And you'll see it says illiterati right there at the end. So that's an indication that they could not read or write. But that's basically a birth record, and that's the standard pattern. You're going to have the date of registration, you're going to have the information on the registrar, you're going to have the town they're from, and then you're still going to start getting the actual information for the person you're looking for. Now, here's an example of a death record. We've got 4 of them on these 2 pages, and we're going to focus in on this one, Angelo Volpi. Okay, here's the father of Giuseppe. This is his death record, okay? And it runs pretty much the same way as the birth records do. It's going to establish the date, the time, the registration's information, and the town, okay? Doesn't necessarily mean he died the same day they're registered, but it would give you more information as we go on. So now we have 2 people came into the registration's office, Francesco Bergio and Antonio Marciullo. Again, how old are they? What do they do for a living? Where do they live? So that's the information you're going to see on 2 and on 3. Okay, that's what's handwritten today. And then they both live in Licata. Okay, so then we get to the information about Angelo's death. 4 a.m. today. So it is the same day as the registration at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it says here, Geo, or I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that means today, okay? Again, look for those genealogy word lists so you can know today or yesterday or those kind of information. And then he gives Angelo's name. He's 75 years old at this point. He was a farmer in Licata. He was born in Licata. And then he gives his parents' names. Now, if you see that information, we saw that on the headstone. The letters FU in front of a name means late or deceased. So his parents are both deceased, Vincenzo and Vincenza. And Vincenza's maiden name was Labraca. We've gone another generation back, okay? They were both from Licata. Again, we're going to look at the wife's name. Remember I said they also include that too. So we know this is the same Angelo Volpi because he's married to Carmela Ripolino. There she is again. And you'll notice they tried to squeeze her name down the side of the page. So just be aware of that. So there's your information. So we've got the people who came to indicate who died, the name of the person who died, his information, his parents' information, and his wife's information. And Carmela is still alive, but if she wasn't, they would also indicate that as well. And then the last piece is always going to be the witnesses. We have two witnesses here. We have Nicolo and Francesco, both with the last name of Volpe. They're related to Angelo in some way, probably sons, but we're going to take a look at that and do some more research. Also gives their years, their occupation, and where they live. Once again, the registrar is the only one who signs it because the rest of them can't read or write. But the pattern is the same, pretty much similar to the birth records, right? Now here is an example of a marriage record. Okay, it's a little bit longer. It's got a little bit more information on it, but I want to show you this part here. Carmelo Lumia and Vincenza Volpe. This is their marriage record, but you'll also notice that they indicate birth information here. Here's the information. He was number 202, and this particular year he was born, and then it lists her information down here. She was born in 1880, and she was the 662nd person born in that year. So right then and there, we know that, oh, I've got records in Licata for their births. I can look at that if I cannot find the information that's attached to the marriage record. Because remember, they're supposed to include that. But, you know, if they stayed in the same town and they passed away, that information would also be included. So once again, we're going to have pretty much a similar pattern. This is the date, September 4th, 1904, at 12:20 p.m. in the town of Licata. That's when they came in to register in the civil registration office. Then it's going to list the groom's information, his name, his age, what he does for a living, where he was born, where he lives, and his parents' names. So not only do we know Carmelo is 30, a farmer, he was born and lives in Licata, we also know he's the son of the late Salvatore, who lived in Licata, and Vincenza Armato. So now we have another maiden name to investigate. And she's still living in Licata, okay? And we get all that in that first piece. And again, we're looking at just the information that's been handwritten in. And then they do the same thing for the bride. Now, this is what got me interested right here. The bride is Vincenza Volpe. She's 23. She's not listed as a farmer, as most people would be. She's listed as a housewife. So that's an indication that something's going on here, and we're going to find out pretty soon what it is. She was born in Licata. She lives in Licata. She's the daughter of the late Angelo, we just saw his death record, who lived in Licata, and Carmela Ripolino, who's still alive and living in Licata, okay? So we know this is the same family. And we've got more information on the generations, so we can go backward in time to look at records. And then you have this big gap where it's just basically, I'm telling you the civil code, I'm letting you know what is expected. We're asking the bride and the groom if they do intend to get married, and they will answer in the affirmative. And then we skip down to the other important piece, which is the witnesses. So we have two witnesses again, Antonio Bonifico and Giuseppe Volpe. Okay, so this Giuseppe and Vincenza are siblings. We're finding out how old they are at this time period and what their occupation is, and they all live in Licata. Now, here's the thing. Then I find a date here, 2:02 p.m. on the 21st of August, okay? Remember, this is in September that they've come into the registrar's office to register, but Vincenza's listed as a housewife. So this is the date for the church wedding, okay? So I'm going to have to go look at church records and find the church in August 21st, but this is the civil record that they did a few days later, okay? Once again, the only person who signed this is the registrar. We still have the line here that says, you know, they were illiterate. I read all the stuff to them. They said, yes, that's exactly what happened. And they didn't sign because they couldn't read or write. But again, you have a similar pattern involved in the marriage record, just like you do in the birth and the death records. Now, where are we going to find these records? Well, you can write to the parish. How long it will take you to get an answer back is another question entirely, but a lot of this stuff is on Family Search. It may not be indexed yet, but you can always take a look at Family Search and see. Ancestry only has an index. And then we have the Italian National Archives, which is a relatively new website where they're putting up as many of the records as they can possibly put up. It's still in the stage of adding more and more records, but it's called the Ancestors Portal. That's the way you'll find it on Google or Bing or something like that. Just type in Ancestors Portal and you'll find it. You can go to the state archives websites to see what lists they have. Maybe you're curious as to where your surname fits in Italy. There's surnames in Italy directories, links to other resources. Italian names does show the distribution of surnames, which is kind of fun. Or, like I said, if you want to write to the provincial archives or the actual parish, you will need to do it in Italian, including the pertinent information that you know. There is a book by Trafford Cole who has a particular template, as well as on Family Search's wiki. You can find templates where you just have to put in the actual information that you're looking for, and the rest of it is already done for you. And for those of you in person here, that book is on the cart there and available for checkout. It's also got a nice genealogy word list. Let me look and see what the title is for everybody. And check it out. I mean, who? Here's the library card. Yeah. Not here. I think what the library. Yeah, I got it. Oh, you do. Yeah. So the name of the book is Italian Genealogical Records: How to Use Italian Civil, Ecclesiastical, and Other Records in Family History Research by Trafford R. Cole. And it's a great book. I have a copy of it at home. It's very good. It was written back in the 90s, but a lot of that stuff is still pertinent today. So here's an example. Here's Family Search's catalog. So if you go to their catalog and it defaults up to place, just start typing the place in. So for example, if you type in Licata, the first thing that pops down is Licata, Agrigento, Sicily, Italy. Now there's another thing I wanted to mention. Remember when we looked at Gaetano Ripolino's headstone? It said Girgente. Well, Agrigento used to be called Girgente back in the mid-1800s. Again, you need to look and see during the time period your ancestor was there, whether or not they changed things. But right now, currently it's called Agrigento. There's also a town called Agrigento in Agrigento. But it lists the region Sicily and the country Italy. So you're going to click on that. And then you're going to search. And you'll get a listing. I narrowed it down to the civil registrations because they do have Licata civil registration on Family Search's website. And then it gives you a listing within that of the civil registrations. You can see they start in 1820 and go up to 1910. And then they also have another block that goes from 1911 to 1943. So depending on the time period you're looking at, most of us will probably go to the 1820 to 1910. And then it will give you source information, and you'll see it's online because those blue lines down there indicate that you can actually search online. Sometimes they will have the stuff digitized, but they won't have it indexed yet. So you'll have to page through like you would go through a roll of microfilm. But a lot of these, for at least this particular town, have been digitized and indexed. So you can just click there, type in the name you're looking for, and see what you can pull up. Now this one's kind of fun, the Italian names website. It will let you look for a name. So say, for example, they're looking for a name, and this is an Italian name. I thought it was French in the beginning, but no, it's actually Italian, Di Felice. You can search for that and see where that name appears in Italy. Then they give you a map and they show you, these are the regions. We start with the regions first. Here's the regions and the numbers where that particular surname is located. So let's say we want to narrow it down to the Abruzzo region, or the Abruzzo province. So we can go ahead and click on that, and it will take us further into it, and you'll get the numbers for the different towns. But you can keep on going. You can, let's say we want to go to L'Aquila, which is a province. And then it'll tell you, here are the towns. And it tells you the number. Now, what is interesting is my maternal grandmother's ancestors came from a town in L'Aquila province called Rivasandoli. There are no De Felices still in Rivasandoli, as you notice by the map. This is a current map. They have all moved to L'Aquila. That's where they're located now. But it's still interesting to see where they were located and where they are today. Now, this is the Ancestors portal for the National Archives of Italy, okay? You can search by name, or you can search the registries. I usually want to go in through the town area and narrow it down from there, because it just makes it easier for me, but you can always do it by the surname. So let's say, for example, Rivasandoli, you can start typing that in. It will do a drop down. You can click on that, and then you will get a listing. It will be mostly in Italian. However, at the very top of the screen on the right-hand side, it will say English. You can click on that, and it will translate everything to English. Sometimes it will revert back to Italian, and then you have to click it again. It's not foolproof, but if after a while, you're going to get used to the Italian words, and you won't need the English translation anymore. But like on Ancestry, the left-hand side is going to have categories that you can narrow it down with. So for instance, let's say we had over 300 results when we just used Rivasandoli. So let's say we want to narrow it down to birth records. So not to use birth records. So we click on that. Now we've got 57 results. And we can look at the different registries for the different years. Let's say we're looking at 1809, the earliest one they have. We can click on that. And it will give us basically what you would normally find if they had digitized a microfilm roll and they haven't indexed it yet. And you can page through that particular volume and see the information you want for the particular surname you want, okay? But you will find that there are some records on this one that's not on Family Search, okay? Not only will they have the registrations for those after Italy became a country, but before Italy became a country. You'll see some Napoleonic, it'll say Napoleonic on it. And that means those are the registers that happened during the time Napoleon was in charge. So we're going to open it up for questions, but I do want to put this up on the screen in case you come up with a question tomorrow or the next day that you would like an answer to. That email address there is our query service. So you can write us an email and say, where might I find A, B, and C? Or I'm looking for a 1920 census for this person who was born this particular date. I can't find it on Ancestry. Is there someplace else I can find it? Or do you have a copy of it that you could send to me? Something to that effect. You know, we don't do complete and total ancestries of people. We don't do family trees, but we will answer specific questions. You can call us and talk to somebody, or you can come in and talk to somebody, or you can go to our website and see what we have. Because we also have some shorter online classes, like little 15-minute things on US Census records, on how to begin your genealogy, you know, tracing immigrant origins, which will go in a little more detail into some of the US records that we talked about earlier. So you can take a look at those as well and just see what kind of collections we have here and what databases we have as well. If you have a library card, obviously you can access a lot of these databases remotely. Ancestry, Find My Past, and American Ancestors are three you cannot. You have to be in a Mid-Continent library to do that. American Ancestors, you have to be in this particular library to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean, for example, you folks online, if you're in another state, that there's not a library close to you that might have those similar databases as well that you can access.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.